Your firm is using AI tools right now for client recommendations, for surveillance, for communications, for record keeping, and FINRA and the SEC have both published their 2026 oversight priorities. They are now in examination scope. The 2026 priorities state they will assess whether you supervise those tools, not whether you approved them, whether you supervise them. Those are not the same obligation. And the difference between those two words is where corporate fraud exposure now lives. In December 2025, FINRA released its 2026 Annual Regulatory Oversight Report. In November 2025, the SEC Division of Examinations released its 2026 examination priorities. Both documents name the same gap and describe the same examination vector. And many compliance teams have not read either one closely enough. By the end of this episode, you will know the 3 specific control failures that FINRA and SEC examiners are now testing for, and exactly what your written supervisory procedures need to address before an examiner asks to see them. 3 vectors, all documented, all in effect now. Most compliance teams believe their AI tools are covered. They went through procurement review, legal signed off, IT approved access. The tools are deployed and in use. That sequence feels like compliance. It is not. FINRA's position, stated explicitly in the 2026 report, is that compliance with FINRA rules and federal securities laws applies to GenAI use regardless of how the tool was acquired or who approved it. Approval satisfies procurement governance. It does not satisfy supervisory governance. Your firm can satisfy one completely and fail the other entirely. FINRA states it directly. Firms that use generative AI, GenAI, should ensure that their use of GenAI is consistent with their regulatory obligations, including with respect to supervision, cybersecurity and technology governance, communications with the public, books and records, and AML and fraud monitoring. This episode examines 3 examination vectors, the 3 areas where FINRA and SEC examiners will test your controls. Each vector represents a documented gap in how many firms currently operate. We examine each one using the exact language regulators published in November and December of 2025. No interpretation, no speculation. Regulatory text and what it requires. The first examination vector is written supervisory procedures. FINRA's 2026 report names WSPs as the baseline test, not general AI governance documents, not IT security policies. WSPs, the specific role-mapped procedural documents that define how each type of AI use is supervised inside your firm, and FINRA is explicit about what those WSPs must cover. Quote from the 2026 FINRA Annual Regulatory Oversight Report. Firms should have reasonably designed supervisory systems, including written supervisory procedures, WSPs, to supervise the use of GenAI in their businesses, including to address the risk of GenAI generating inaccurate, misleading, or fabricated, hallucinated information, and the potential misuse of GenAI by associated persons or customers, for example, to perpetrate fraud, including impersonation schemes, or to evade firms' surveillance and monitoring systems. 3 obligations in that single passage. First, hallucination risk. Your WSPs must explicitly address the possibility that your AI tools produce fabricated outputs. Second, insider misuse. Your WSPs must cover scenarios where an associated person uses GenAI to perpetrate fraud. Third, customer-side evasion. Your WSPs must account for clients using AI to defeat your surveillance systems. If your written supervisory procedures were last updated before your firm adopted GenAI tools, examiners may identify that gap on review. The document will not say what it needs to say. that is, a documented control failure. The second vector is where many compliance teams make a structural error. They believe that using a third-party GenAI vendor distributes some of the regulatory obligation. The vendor has its own compliance program. The vendor's model governance is their responsibility. That assumption is wrong. FINRA's 2026 report addresses this directly. Quote, "Firms remain responsible for compliance with FINRA rules and federal securities laws when using GenAI tools developed by third-party vendors. Firms should perform appropriate due diligence, maintain ongoing oversight, and implement controls to address vendor-related risks, including data privacy and security, model governance, and incident response. Every AI vendor your firm uses requires a documented oversight program that your examiners can inspect. Not the vendor's documentation, yours. That means due diligence records showing what you evaluated before deployment. Ongoing oversight documentation showing what you monitor after deployment. Model governance records showing how you manage version changes, output drift, and performance degradation, and incident response procedures covering what happens when the AI tool fails, produces harmful output, or is compromised. Many firms have vendor contracts. They do not have vendor oversight programs. Those are different things. FINRA goes further in the same section. The passage that requires WSPs to cover GenAI use explicitly names impersonation schemes as a misuse vector your supervisory procedures must address. The threat FINRA is documenting is not only an external attacker using deepfake technology against your firm, it is an associated person, someone inside your organization, using GenAI to create impersonation content, and a customer using AI tools to defeat your surveillance systems from the outside. This is the deepfake impersonation risk entering through the supervisory compliance door. FINRA states, controls must address it, and WSPs must name it. If neither does, the examination gap is documented. The third examination vector is where exposure reaches board level and senior leadership. 2 SEC requirements operating simultaneously. The first is books and records. From the SEC's 2026 examination priorities, the division will examine whether AI-driven recommendations and outputs are consistent with investors' stated investment objectives and best interests, and whether firms maintain books and records sufficient to document how AI tools are used in formulating recommendations or taking other actions on behalf of clients. In practice, many firms may struggle to reconstruct the full AI decision trail consistently. AI-assisted recommendations are made. The output is recorded. The process that generated the output, which model version, which inputs, which parameters, which logic, is not systematically captured in client-facing documentation. Examiners may ask for it. In many cases, that documentation does not exist. That is not a technical gap. That is a books and records failure under existing regulatory requirements. The second SEC requirement in this vector, the division will review the accuracy of registrants' representations regarding their AI capabilities and will evaluate whether any such representations are fair and not misleading in light of firms' actual practices and the limitations of their AI tools. This creates a direct line from your marketing materials, your client disclosures, and your ADV filings to examination findings. If your firm has represented AI capabilities that exceed your actual supervisory controls, even through standard marketing language describing AI-enhanced services, that gap falls within the SEC's stated examination scope. This is where corporate fraud exposure becomes concrete. Firms that overstate AI capabilities while operating procedures that do not cover those tools may be creating a documented misrepresentation. Examiners are looking for exactly that. Examination findings are not enforcement actions, but they are the documented predicate for enforcement actions. The trajectory typically looks like this. An examination finding on supervisory deficiency leads to a deficiency letter. The deficiency letter requires documented remediation. Remediation triggers re-examination. If controls remain deficient, a formal enforcement referral often follows. The SEC's 2026 examination priorities and FINRA's 2026 oversight report were not published to describe what happened last year. They describe what examiners are testing in active examination cycles now. FINRA's report was published in December 2025. The SEC priorities were published in November 2025. These mandates are in effect. A firm entering an examination cycle in 2026 with GenAI tools in deployment and WSPs that predate those tools is entering with a published, documented gap. Examiners know what to look for. The question is whether your firm has addressed it. 3 examination vectors. 3 documented control failures. 3 obligations your written supervisory procedures must address before an examiner asks to see them. First, WSP deficiency. Your procedures must explicitly cover GenAI use, hallucination risk, insider misuse, and AI-enabled surveillance evasion. Second, vendor governance failure. Third-party origin does not transfer your regulatory obligation. Documentation of oversight, model governance, and incident response remains with your firm. Third, books and records and AI capability representations. The reasoning chain behind AI-assisted recommendations must be reconstructable, and your representations about AI capabilities must align with your actual supervisory controls. These are not interpretations of regulatory intent. These are the exact obligations FINRA and the SEC published in their 2026 oversight documents. ScamBeast analyzes corporate fraud patterns and governance failures using primary regulatory sources. Everything in this episode is sourced directly from FINRA's 2026 Annual Regulatory Oversight Report and the SEC Division of Examinations 2026 Priorities, both linked in the description and pinned comment. Follow ScamBeast if you work in finance, tech, or leadership. Full sources and documentation are in the description.